Hi, so the benefit of impact evaluations that use randomized control trial designs is that we don't usually have to spend a lot of time talking about estimation or statistics, which is kind of unfortunate in the case of Cyrus because he can do some really fabulous statistics. But fortunate for me in this case. But what that allows us to do is to spend more time thinking about things like program design and measurement and theory of change. So those are the things I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to do them in a bit of a different order to try and go from kind of smaller issues to bigger issues. So I'll start with measurement. One of the things that I like about this paper, and I expect from Cyrus, is that there are not only multiple ways of measuring the same kinds of outcomes, so different, the artifactual measurements as well as the self-reported survey evidence, but also different sources of data. So the polling data combined with the survey data. And so that attempt to measure obviously non-quantitative concepts in a variety of ways, I think really strengthens the paper. A few, again, small comments. One, and this is me as an industrial organization economist, which I used to be a long time ago, is that I think it might be interesting to look at other concentration indices in addition to the Herfindahl. I know I've seen it used in political science before, and I haven't seen others. And it's not data mining to use other indices because they really do kind of measure different aspects of concentration or diversity. And given that you're getting something there, it could be interesting to see if different ways of measuring diversity helps you understand what's going on. On the artifactual measures, I like them, and I like them because they are real things. So it was a real petition. You did end up delivering it, I think you told me, in the past, and so on. My concern, I have a couple concerns. One is that I still think you could get courtesy bias. So the people who've had the civic education know that this kind of thing, that they're supposed to be more engaged in this kind of thing, and so maybe more engaged. So they may be willing to sign the petition, which is real. So it's a real petition and they really signed it. So in that sense, you've measured real activity, except for that doesn't mean that they're going to sign it the next time. When somebody just offers it to them and it's not part of the surveying. So I think it's important to just recognize that. I'm also interested in knowing the order that the tests were implemented. I mean, it seemed like a lot to me. I sort of, after a while, I thought, oh, there's another good idea for measurement, and there's another good idea, and but, after a while, I'm thinking, okay, these people are going to sort of say, okay, now I've got to do what? Now you're asking me about what kind of survey, news service or whatever. And so I wonder if they would have kind of burned out. And if you always did them in the same order, did you find that the one that you did last was had the least results because people were burning out? Or did you mix them up in a way that at least that burnout would be diluted a little bit? And then the final thing is I guess I'll form this as a compliment, is that I like that you in all your tables report both the index version as well as the individual measurements that go into the index, so that we have a sense of what's really going on with that composite outcome measurement. I want to decide what I want to say next. I guess move to talk a little bit about program design and incorporate, I guess, the discussion of the theory of change in there. And a lot of what I'm going to say now, I think, is more lessons learned for the future than something that you can really do now because it's already done. And my overall comment here is that when we're in a situation where we're conducting a randomized control trial and it's a pilot implementation, I think it's important for researchers to recognize that they are both program implementers or program designers and researchers. And in the role as program implementers, they need to take on all the roles and responsibilities that we expect for people who are implementing real programs that are rolled out to real people. Even though these are pilots, they're still affecting real people's lives during the period that they're implemented. And so I would have thought that particularly the security intervention would have been better grounded in formative research before you rolled it out. And in fact, you talked about, well, this is not surprising given the observational research that we've done. So I'm wondering why that observational research didn't better inform the design of this program going in. I realize that it's an interesting balance. So on the one hand, if you had a really good idea of how to design a security enhancement program, you might have a clinical equipoise problem with randomly rolling it out. So the fact that, as you say, well, it's just an abracadabra, we didn't really know, it was entirely empirical question, gives you that clinical equipoise, but then it also leaves you with not, again, you feel like you don't have much to do, didn't learn much from it in the end. Whereas given all of that knowledge and research that you had done going into it, you might have been able to design something that had a better chance of being effective. And you said several things that make me wonder why you went with this intervention to begin with, that the peacekeepers had failed dramatically in recent years, and yet the intervention was built around the peacekeepers and things like that. Secondly, and I think that these comments relate much more to the security intervention than the civic education intervention. So I think for that intervention, we do have a lot of evidence that similar types of interventions have worked in different environments. I think that the study here is very important for showing that it works in this post-conflict environment, whereas other studies may not have been done. So I think that that's very important, but I think there's less need to support the design of that intervention with a lot of formative research because there's more in the past. But there hasn't been as much for the security intervention, which makes it very interesting, but I think requires a little more grounding. Similarly, I think that a lot of the hypotheses that you suggest in the end are things you probably could have thought about at the beginning and therefore made them empirical questions from the beginning rather than guesses at the end. So for example, on civic education, the idea that becoming more informed and discussing things more openly might make you more attuned to intimidation, I think is something that you could have anticipated. And so I would have liked to have seen, for both interventions and also for the interaction of the two interventions, a lot more upfront thinking about what are all the different ways this could play out. We really don't know how this might play out in some ways, and so let's think about all the different ways that this can play out so that we have a better idea of what our competing theories of change might be, rather than having sort of two straightforward hypotheses that then aren't necessarily supported, and then we've got to ask a lot of questions after the fact. And the third point, again, relates to that, which is I think that that exercise is even more important in this post-conflict, unstable situation. So the kind of analysis where actually you're forcing yourself to think about all of the ways that this might play out and all of the things that might go well, but also all of the things that might go wrong, is really very similar to the kind of do no harm analysis or the conflict-sensitive impact analysis that program designers use in these kinds of peace-building settings. And so forcing themselves to sit down at the beginning and saying, what's the conflict situation? What are the dividers? What are the connectors? So how are the ways that our intervention specifically that we have in mind would strengthen connectors or worsen dividers? And part of that is to be responsible programmers because you're bringing this intervention into this situation. But then part of this is also helping you tease out your theory of change in advance so that you are collecting both your quantitative data and your qualitative data that allow you to answer your questions better at the end. One thing I will say about the program design that I liked, though, is the fact that it did fit in with one of these mandates that UNMIL had, and so at least from that sense, it was a real possibility, and they accepted it. So I thought that was a nice feature of the program design, and I'll leave it at that.
All right, terrific. Should we open it up, or
if you want to respond first?
Yeah, just really quickly, just on two of the points. So the observational studies that Erica and I had done were studies that were commissioned by the UN Oversight Office to try and get some quantitative data on the local level impacts of the peacekeeping missions. And so we did one of these studies with them in Cote d'Ivoire, and then we did one in Liberia. And the conclusion that we came away with was that, in fact, like there was very little evidence to suggest that they were doing anything to change like perceptions of vulnerability like on the ground, and that was very consistent with evidence from the qualitative evidence from Cyrus study in DRC. Is anybody here familiar with that work? So she opens the book with this like heartbreaking story of I think it was Pakistani battalion who have performed very admirably in that mission, I must say. In Bukavu, there was a deployment there, a base there, and there was a child who came running to the base, trying to sort of explain something or catch their attention, everything. And so they, their assumption was that, okay, this is something that they had seen before as a child, coming by, like maybe trying to get some pencils and some chocolate or something like that. And there were a lot of kids who had come through, and so they gave the kid some pencils and some chocolate and said, thank you for coming and visiting us. We hope that you appreciate what's going on, and that we're trying to help you and everything like that. And he was trying to explain and speaking French, not perfect French, but French that anybody who was a French speaker should have been able to understand. And then left and was despondent about the whole interaction. And then there was an NGO worker who sort of caught up with this kid, and he explained what was going on. And what he was trying to do was to explain that there was an armed group that was coming and occupying their village, and the community had sent him to come out and see if maybe the MONUC could deploy somebody to come and just sort of reason with them because they're being very abusive in the community. And this like heartbreaking story was sort of indicative of like a major problem with the mission there, which was this lack of interaction, communication ability with communities that was there. I mean, it was brought in very sharp relief. And so the thought was that, okay, the peacekeeping missions have not done, let's say, as good a job as we would like in terms of helping to relieve a sense of vulnerability in the countryside, in these places, right? Well, on the one hand, there were those who said, okay, well, I mean, the evidence that you're using, okay, this is an anecdote, and you and Eric, your studies in Ivory Coast and Liberia, they're just these observational studies. It's all just selection bias in any way. Like, it's not very credible. So, like, if you could do, like, you could somehow randomize peacekeepers, like, you'd be able to get at this. And, of course, that's, like, it's kind of a ridiculous proposition. But what we did is actually kind of close to that in a sense, right? And then the other thought was that, okay, well, in principle, they should be effective should we solve these problems of communication, and sort of, like, regularize institutional interaction with people that they're supposed to be serving. And we had a frank discussion with the UNMIL folks about all of this, and they sort of agreed, like, yeah, I mean, these are things we would like to improve upon. And so it was on that basis that the Security Committee intervention was designed, right, to provide a way of both getting, like, some credible evidence, but then also to try and, like, correct some of these, minor but nevertheless extremely consequential flaws or deficiencies in the way that these programs operate. But as it turned out, it didn't really do much. So, I mean, it's just a lot harder, maybe. So maybe now we go back and we give a little bit more credit to UNMIL and say, like, okay, well, it's actually really hard to change, like, these conditions of vulnerability. It's like, it's just not that easy, Who knows what it takes to do it? Putting people in jail might be the way that you do it, and they just don't have the mandate to aggressively go out and, like, capture people and put them in jail. But maybe that's what's required, is, like, finding all the thugs, party thugs and stuff like that, and putting them in jail. I don't know. It's hard to say. But this kind of, like, soft engagement sort of thing certainly doesn't seem to work. Anyway. And then just on the artifactual measures, I mean, it wasn't like a kind of thing where here's the petition and then you do it and then it's like, oh, and here's the fictional, all the stuff was kind of laid out in front of them. Like it was all done at the end of the interview. And the protocol was that they would sort of lay out, they're like, there's some activities that we want to do here, this, and this, and so let's just sort of go through them one by one. So there was like we didn't randomize the order because there was a certain flow that was necessary, but we tried to like manage expectations and to set it up so people could pace themselves in going through the activities. But I appreciate it. It was a lot, definitely, that we had in there. But sure. Who wants to direct the? Yeah. Okay, sure.
Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, I had one point, one question. The first point was on the, with regard to the increase in voter intimidation.
Yeah.
Whether you'd considered kind of sort of like an information, I guess kind of a revealed preferences type narrative where people are talking more openly about things that are probably indicative of their voting behavior, so other people have more information and can kind of, hey, actually, this is not the way you want to go. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, I wondered if I ask you to comment a little bit on this diversity measure, because it's not clear to me that a movement from parochial or, I guess, regional or smaller scale parties to more centralized voting behaviors is an ambiguously good thing. Mm-hmm. So I wondered if you could comment partially on, I guess, on the normative aspect of that, and a little bit as well on what kind of mechanics you think you're driving that, because we have local public goods as well as national public goods, and it's not perfectly clear to me that one is preferable over the other.
Yeah. Should we collect a few?
Yeah, we can collect a few.
I'll be right back. I'm assuming the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. This was a really interesting presentation. I look forward to reading the paper, actually. I printed it out, but never got around to reading it yet. I just had a question, not to hark too much on the security committee issue, but I think there's some reason why one would want to look again at the literature. And you talked about the qualitative work in DRC, you talked about your observational research in Liberia itself, but is there any experimental evidence at all that and if it's not in exactly the kind of society and political context like Liberia, in some other context, maybe where there are only localized conflict issues, but it's not a huge post-conflict state, something where you can kind of compare your results with other literature, and if it's different, to look closer at how they did the experiment there. As far as the elections, I was wondering, you're talking all along about the presidential elections. Were there local elections or provincial elections, especially local elections, that took place at the same time, which often happens, not always, where you could look at whether preferences for, I don't know, parochial, however you define it in different ways, parochial types of candidates, as opposed to the national-oriented candidates, whether that differed for local and presidential elections? Is there anything from your data that you can draw from there? I think there'd be some interesting interpretations from that.
I had a question about the design of the security committee intervention. I was wondering how you decided to have the committees go to the deployment bases for their meeting instead of having people come from the deployment bases to the community, because I think that might bolster the perception of security. I was wondering if there's logistical reasons or some other reason why the opposite was done.
We have a question up.
No, it's okay. I think
We need it for the video.
Okay, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it was a really interesting paper. I was wondering whether or not the timing or focusing the study around the election might have impacted the results in terms of security and feelings of security. I mean, it seems to me that party loyalists are most likely to abuse fellow citizens or fellow Liberians around election periods. And so it might have just been the case that designing and implementing the study, obviously it was important to do it around election, but it might have different effects also civic education is an ongoing, continuing process, and maybe it might have had, you saw larger effects because it was around election time.
Okay, one more, I guess, and then we'll
Yeah,
let you
sounds good.
respond.
Thank you. And these are two really basic questions. For the security committee, how were the respondents, the members, selected? Because that really does make a difference. And was there a conscious effort to make sure that women were included, since they're the ones that are most vulnerable? And the second one is about civic education, because there's such high illiteracy in Liberia. Were people self-selected, or how did you account for the fact that so many respondents, particularly those that are vulnerable to rumors, are not literate and have to rely upon others for their information? Thank you.
Okay, great. Let me just finish writing. Okay. Thank you very much. So I'll just go through the questions in the order that they're asked. They're really, really great questions. The normative interpretation of parochial type voting or voting for local sort of candidates versus national, I think that's an interesting one. When we were designing the study, and we had a kind of theory about how the conditions that prevail in fragile states will tend to result in these local security monopolies. That's what the theory led us to believe, and so in a way, and so we thought that that in itself, because that result or that equilibrium is a product of sort of severe constraints being put on democratic expression, right? That it is probably inherently a bad thing, and so therefore, to the extent that credible alternatives such as national appeals and things like that can be introduced, and people choose to vote for them, to the extent that that does happen, it does seem to then make the theory seem plausible about what prevailing conditions are like in fragile state settings, and so this is an issue. And that because it's a result of broadened set of choices being made available, or people being made aware of that, and that's what induces a shift, that it should be a good thing. We're seeing more diversity in what's being expressed, but that is looking at things in almost like myopically, just in terms of people making a choice at the ballot box. It doesn't say anything about the quality of the services that people might receive as a result of that choice. So is there the possibility for adverse consequences? It's an interesting question. So if what we've done is to enhance a set of credible alternatives and get people to then vote for national parties at the expense of local elites, but that does nothing to change the decision-making of the national parties, and all it does is piss off the local elites, that actually the local communities could end up worse off, right? Because now they have nobody to do their bidding for them, because they've alienated the person who would be their national lobbyist, as it were. And I think that's a very interesting question. I think that would warrant further analysis of data collection into how these communities are faring on the basis of the choices that they made electorally and the differences that occurred. And I think it's definitely a worthwhile thing to study. I mean, for us, it was important to just demonstrate that this sort of localized political monopoly equilibrium seems to exist, and that promoting diversity of vote choice, was evidence of that fact in a way, but the consequences of that are something we have to think about. So I appreciate you raising that consideration, because it's one thing that we definitely want to look at. It could work the other way, right? It could be that, to the extent that what the local elites were doing was to sort of secure power to, sort of win rewards that they, for the most part, pocketed for themselves and did little to share their constituencies, at least not as much as they could. now maybe it opens space for, the National Party to be more directly responsive to these communities and be more willing to invest, One thing is for sure is in a lot of these communities, the amounts of public investment were abysmally low. So whatever the case may be, it wasn't working, So that'll be a good thing to follow up on. So what we'd like to see are what types of public investment is going on in these communities for these good choices. Very good question. I think it's exactly the kinds of questions we need to ask about these sorts of things. Okay, there was a question as to whether or not there was any other experimental work that's been done that we could relate what we've done to. So, certainly with peacekeepers and intervening forces and all this kind of stuff, as far as I know, there has not been. But there is a rich experimental literature in criminology that is sort of related, right? So, policing in big cities where you have a type of a vulnerability equilibrium that tends to persist there, is relevant. Okay, so you're talking about urban areas and advanced industrial states, so it's about as far removed as you could possibly be in certain respects, but not so far removed in other respects in terms of the nature of the vulnerability that people feel. And so there is a rich experimental literature on hotspots and community-based policing and things like that we should look at. So I hadn't really considered to do so, but it might be helpful. So that's what I would think. Yeah. Okay. Then you had asked about whether we had data on elections to local offices. So this is general elections. So we have House, Senate, presidential elections. They're all national level offices, but have obviously the House election. At least what was interesting is that if you actually look at the the House elections, the ballots varied from constituency to constituency on the basis of who was running. And what was funny was that the national parties would just try and put somebody everywhere. And sometimes I don't know if they made up the name, or there would be these names that would just kind of appear quite regularly all over the place. And I think they're just putting some placeholder there or something, or maybe because I think one person can stand in multiple constituencies, they just had one man or one woman who was just standing in multiple places. See maybe if in one of those places they got enough vote shares to actually win. I don't know. It becomes difficult then, as a result of that, to do this analysis of national versus parochial candidates. The runoff system and the fact that you get this proliferation of parochial parties creates this really great setting where we can study at the presidential level voting for parochial versus national candidates. When you get down to the House races, it becomes more difficult because the credibility of, let's say, the UP candidate in a given area is going to vary dramatically. So it's just going to be very noisy. But it's not to say we shouldn't look at it. We do have the data to do so. Okay. The question on why we had people go to the deployment bases. So this gets at this issue of not being able to randomize where peacekeepers go. So it was just not something. Who was it that asked the question? Was it? Yeah. Sorry. It was just they wouldn't allow us to do that. What did happen was that the communities that participated, some fraction of them, which had no direct exposure, aside from an APV driving down the road to the peacekeepers, did get visits. And so that did happen on occasion. Now, I think it was a minority of the, 80 or so communities that received this program, but it did happen. And, because we couldn't assign them to go to the villages, which I agree would be a much more profound thing because the entire community would witness it and everything. We thought that this was a way of at least creating this institutionalized contact and information flow that's kind of a second best, maybe a far second best from what would be ideal, would be to have actual patrols happening there. But it was something that they just would not do. They just could not do. They couldn't surrender their deployment to a couple of researchers from New York. Okay, Patrice, on whether the interventions would have different effects if we had done them in a non-electoral setting, right? Yeah, I think that all of the issues that we were interested in studying here become especially salient in the context of the elections, and that's why just made a lot of sense to do it. So my expectation was that you just see a lot of things being muted, because issues simply wouldn't be as salient, But it was intended to be an electoral assistance thing, right? Yeah. I mean, there was talk a year prior, about what are we going to do to make sure that these elections, go off smoothly and are not marred by violence, given what was happening. And you have to remember what was happening in the neighborhood at the time. I mean, the Ivory Coast crisis was horrific. And there was direct spillover from that because there were sort of, mercenary types who were kind of, gone over the border and were fighting there and kind of returning, and all these issues about them, maybe, I don't know, creating havoc during this election cycle were very, very real concerns. So it was actually Jendai Frazier, who had left the National Security Council by that time, was doing a sort of fellowship at Carnegie Mellon, actually organized this big conference. I think it was the November in 2010 or December 2010, on preventing violence in the Liberian elections, and Sirleaf was there, and the UN ambassador, or the SRSG was there, and the U.S. ambassador, and all these people were there, and they were kind of and the study and everything sort of came out of that general, sort of ferment around that time. Okay, and then these questions on the nomination of the Security Committee members. It was actually something that so as part of the study, we actually, for half of the communities, had them nominated through, we organized a community meeting and then had a balloting procedure to nominate people so that people could put in nominations, and then based on the nominations they could vote on, that were submitted. And then in the other half of the communities, we had an elite selection process, so we just worked with the town chief and had town chief. In neither case, though, did we have a quota or any sort of provision to ensure women's representation. So I think it's a good question, and to the extent that their participation, as let's say, specific representing a particular set of interests would matter to something that we can't really study in this case. But I think it's a very interesting idea, particularly given in this context, movements such as there was the Mono River Valley, sort of women's peace building initiative, which was such an important movement in this setting, and also given the political personalities in this context as well, it could have been a very interesting thing to study. And I think it's one that would be very useful to look at in future work. Similarly, on the civic education side, I mean, so the way that worked was the facilitators went and led the sort of lessons on the curriculum, and then the deliberation for the, it was open for the entire town. So it was just sort of like a big town meeting sort of setting, and participation was voluntary. There weren't people who were selected per se. I mean, we got the assent of the chief, in order to do the activity there, and then, by word of mouth, word was spread to participate. So, and then when we went back and did the data collection, we, randomly selected people from a list of names of all the people who resided, all adults in the town. So I guess what we could do to get at this question, so by design, we have no way of really addressing the issue of whether vulnerability factored into who participates, and how that then in turn affected whether, so if people who felt vulnerable didn't feel comfortable participating, then maybe there was no way to enhance their sense of security as a result, because they're systematically excluded somehow. We could, I suppose, with the survey data, because it was a random sample of all adults in the community, look into that to try and find some way to get some measures of vulnerability, and then also we do have information on whether they participated in the activities and stuff. So we could look at that in the data, potentially.
The security, there were women that were involved in it, and do you have any idea of what the percentage was?
There were women involved, and we do have, we have information. We have, gender information as well as other characteristics of everybody who participated in the security community intervention. I haven't looked at the breakdown on that score yet, but we could definitely look at that.
Well, we've run out of time, so thank you again, Cyrus, and we'll see you all next Thursday.
Okay, thanks a lot.